Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Observer Research Foundation. This afternoon, we're having a discussion on the Sri Lanka elections and the issues flowing from it. This event is part of the Neighborhood Scope series that is run by the ORF. A few weeks ago, the Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna leader, Anura Kumara Dissanayake, was elected as the 9th executive president of Sri Lanka. The JVP's history is well known as its mix of Sinhala-nationalism and Marxism. In the past, it has launched 2 uprisings against the state of Sri Lanka, but later it joined the mainstream and has renounced violence in 1994. Its victory is a clear verdict on the performance of the mainstream politicians who led the country in the recent past. It was the Aragalya movement of 2022 that has brought it to prominence. The Sri Lanka people have reposed their faith on an outsider politician, meaning Anura was considered an outsider, who represents the hopes of the people for good governance, transparency, and economic change. Now, we are going to have this discussion. I have an excellent panel here, but what we are going to do is to do it in a conversation format, meaning it. So I will pose questions to the individual speakers, and you are free to respond in about 5 to 6 minutes. Then I'll go speaker by speaker, and then we'll do another round if time permits. So the panel I have with me, let me introduce the panel. I have Bhagya Senaratne, who is the postdoctoral fellow of Global Asia at the Center for Global Asia, New York University, Shanghai. Previously, she was a senior lecturer in the Department of Strategic Studies at the General Sir John Kotlewala Defense University in Sri Lanka. We have Rajni Gamaje. Dr. Rajni's research interests are in politics of governance and state transformation and the development of inequality in Sri Lanka. She has a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Queensland and an MSc in international relations from the RSIS NTU in Singapore, I guess. We have Talal Rafi. Talal Rafi is an economist and an expert member of the World Economic Forum. He is a regular columnist for the International Monetary Fund, and he was a member of the Deloitte Global Economist Network. He serves on the board of Sri Lanka's premier government foreign policy think tank, the Lakshman Kadrigamar Institute, and he's a fellow of the British think tank, Oxford Global Society. There's more in his biodata, but I'll leave it at that point. He's a highly accomplished person. And finally, we have from the Observer Research Foundation, Aditya Gaudara Shivamurthy, who's an associate fellow with the ORF Strategic Studies Program. He focuses on the broader strategic and security-related developments throughout South Asian region with a specific interest in Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and Bhutan. So I'm going to start my round table, as it were, with a question to Bhagya Senaratne. How do you see China viewing this election? That's a very matter of great curiosity for people in India.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think it's an interesting question, but also looking at it from a broader perspective. China would be very interested in what's going on, especially because JVP has always been, I guess, somewhat a close contact of China. So China would be seeing it quite positively in a sense. But it's also hard to say how involved China is, if that's what you're looking at, because they've been more involved with other Sri Lankan political parties, and I think Rajni could speak more about those internal dynamics. But in terms of China, they've definitely been slightly cautious, at least outwardly. They've met the Sri Lankan president along with several other ambassadors that are stationed in Colombo. And if you see in the statements the Chinese have made, they are saying that they are looking at working with the Sri Lankan government, but also looking at debt restructuring. So I think that commitment there is very important for Sri Lanka, especially because Sri Lanka has been struggling in the debt negotiation or renegotiation front with the Chinese because they haven't been necessarily all too forthcoming. Compared to some of the other partners. So I think this will be an interesting engagement. And also, I think more interestingly for us in Sri Lanka, how does how does President Dissanayaka's government then re-engage with China to see if under him they will be able to come to more favorable terms for Sri Lanka in these renegotiations, something which Wickremesinghe government couldn't do. So I think this is the China front. And also possibly other discussions that would come is, will President Dissanayaka's government be very pro-China? And if so, how does that pan out for, say, the subcontinent, the Indian Ocean region per se, and also for this whole of South Asia? So I think this is something we can look into.
Thank you. My second question is to Dr. Rajni Gamage. Basically, the point is, what are the key takeaways from this election?
Thank you to the chair and to my panelists. I think it's a privilege to be speaking here at ORF. So in trying to make sense of the elections, I think the results can be interpreted in a number of ways. I think foremost that stands out is that President Dissanayake is characterized as a minority president, by which it is meant to say that he did not secure the 50% that in the past presidents have been able to secure. And especially what this means is that this being a minority president, not being able to secure 50%, will very much impact the president's actions as we go up to the parliamentary elections, because the NPP will be attempting its best to secure at least a simple majority, but in the best case scenario, a 2/3 majority. So I think that is perhaps the first and foremost, most important kind of reading of the post-election analysis. The second kind of observation that comes to mind is the state of, or the pattern or the impact of how the northern Tamil vote was made, even in the lead up to the presidential elections. We saw that the northern Tamil vote especially was split and fragmented across several camps. So you had the TNA that was endorsing Sajith Premadasa as a candidate, but what we saw in the eventual outcomes was that Sajith Premadasa did secure a certain amount of the vote, but that former President Ranil Wickremesinghe was also able to secure a significant amount of the Tamil vote because of his past credentials. But very importantly, we also see the emergence of a Tamil common candidate who was able to secure votes not only in the north of Sri Lanka, but also in places where Tamil community is slightly higher, such as in certain areas of Colombo. And then the fourth important part about this voting bloc is that the ACTC, the party that is led by Gajendra Ponnambalam, had called for a boycott of the election. And we saw that within the northern Tamil vote, it was the lowest voter turnout in this election. So this election is significant because voter turnout was low anyway compared to the previous election. And that to some extent, I think, illustrates the disenchantment of the voting of the voters with politics in Sri Lanka. But the north especially was significant because there was a much higher, much lower voter turnout in the north of Sri Lanka. I think the last observation that I'll make from the electoral results is that when we looked at the campaign platforms of the two major parties, there were three major contenders, Wickremesinghe Premadasa from the SJB and the NPP led by Dissanayake. When we looked at the two leading candidates, so the SJB, Premadasa, and Anura Kumara Dissanayake from the NPP, there was this kind of debate about where do they situate themselves ideologically? And by extension, what is the voter base that they appeal to? Because the NPP has this traditional kind of Marxist, or rather this JVP's legacy of appealing to the working classes, the more vulnerable sections of society. But what was very interesting in this election was that Sajid Premadasa, tapping into his credentials of his father's legacy as a pro-poor kind of leader. Sajid Premadasa's the electoral research shows that even the SJB, Premadasa, was able to secure a significant amount of the rural kind of poor constituencies. So I think that this is important when we look at the electoral map, that the anger with the Wickremesinghe government over the economic hardships was clearly seen in the electoral map, but this vote did not go exclusively to the NPP, but SJB was also able to secure part of this vote. So I'll leave it at there.
Now, I'll ask Mr. Talal Rafi, what does the new government mean for Sri Lanka's economic recovery?
So thanks, Manoj, and my thanks to ORF for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to speak today. What does the new government mean? So let me start off. To be very fair to the new president, he's taking over the presidency in a challenging environment. So the only instance where a president took it over in an even more challenging environment was Mr. Wickremesinghe in 2022. So right now our debt is over 100% of GDP, though most of the other macroeconomic indicators have come down. Like, for example, we're almost touching deflation and the stock market's been going up. But most of the reasons could largely be because for the last few months, there was a lot of uncertainty due to the elections. And once that is gone, things are flowing through. So speaking about what is it to the economy, I mean, before the elections, there was a lot of talk about things not going well if elected. Like, for example, there were talks coming out of the camp of, for example, changing the debt sustainability analysis, some of the indicators. But after being elected, what I see is a few positive signs. For example, like he has retained the central bank governor is continuing, and the Treasury Secretary is also continuing his term. So both of them were former alternate IMF directors. So that shows that they have chosen the path of stability and, most importantly, continuing with the IMF program, as President Dissanayake has very clearly mentioned. So at the moment, I think it's just been 2 weeks, so there is a long way to go. And most of the decisions, like, for example, one thing the new NPP government has said is that they want to renegotiate parts of the IMF program, especially when it comes to helping the vulnerable sections and on taxation. So they want to reduce the burden of taxes on the people. So both of these would be done, the negotiations would be done after the general election. So a clearer picture would come out after the general election, because to be fair to them, they only have 3 members. So it's a small cabinet. Plus, as the parliament was dissolved, they still don't have a parliamentary mandate to continue and enact some of the laws that are needed. So on the economic front, as far as I see, the initial signs have been positive, but we'll have to wait till after the general election and for a few months to go before we can get a much clearer picture.
Now, Aditya, what do these elections mean for India?
I think obviously India being one of the closest neighbors of Sri Lanka, and we know we have our own sets of ups and downs in the history for the last couple of decades following independence and even before that. But obviously when Sri Lanka was going to elections, let's just go back to what was India's calculation before the elections took place, right? I think there was a lot of uncertainty in India about who is going to win the election, especially considering how the whole Aragalya movement had dismantled the political ecosystem. There was uncertainty about who will win the elections and who is likely to emerge as a winner. So on India's calculation, I think there was what India saw, there were 4 major stakeholders or 4 major candidates, which was including Namal, Ranil Wickremesinghe, and Premadasa, and Anura. So I think on India's part, they were getting ready for whoever was there, and there were kind of multi-party engagements that was happening, and especially considering JVP, which had been staunchly anti-Indian in the 1970s and 80s, and in the 1960s they were also running these 5 lectures, out of which one of the core components was this anti-India or Indian expansionism in South Asia, was something that they consistently pointed out. I think that is something that both India and Sri Lanka have moved away from right now. Especially with JVP entering the mainstream politics, that kind of staunch anti-India rhetoric had toned down. And I think that toned down further when JVP formed this broader alliance of NPP in 2014, 2013 or something. But then I think even then what JVP was dubbed as a 3% party because they couldn't secure majority of votes or any could do any significant holding over the parliament or in the presidential elections. India was not really worried about JVP in itself being a big player, but I think the Aragalya was in itself a big game changer. So when Aragalya happened and a lot of people started having some faith in Anura Dissanayake, I think India realized that this would be um, we could no longer ignore JVP as we ignored them in the past. And I think it's high time we start engaging them. So, in fact, in February 2024, Anura was invited to India. There were certain interactions because they also wanted to clarify on certain issues that were being politicized, especially on Indian connectivity projects and Indian investments that had increased since the 2022 economic crisis. So, for now, I think both India and Sri Lanka have kind of moved on from whatever historical baggages that existed. On Anura's part, I think there is clear expression that even his manifesto, and I think even when Jaishankar visited Sri Lanka recently, they did clarify that Sri Lanka will never be used to harm Indian security concerns. That was one, and I think India was also quick to respond. High Commissioner Santosh Jha was one of the first people. I think was the first foreign envoy to meet Anura Dissanayake when he got elected. And even before elections, Ajit Doval had met people across the party line. And after the election, S. Jaishankar was the first person to visit Sri Lanka. So I think what we are seeing right now is there is optimism that whatever India had assisted during the economic crisis will continue to have a long-term leverage and benefit. On Sri Lankan side, they see India as a country that is growing economically and somewhere that their economic destinies are intertwined. That as India grows, I think there is more thinking in Sri Lanka that we'll have to integrate more and more India to further tap on economic growth and have an economic recovery. So there is certain optimism that I would say, and they have moved on from historical baggages. But that said, again, there are certain instances and projects that have been politicized by Anura Dissanayake, especially to show that he's someone who is anti-corruption and to show that he's anti. Elite in a way, and that in itself brings a bigger question about what is going to happen next. And this probably, I think we can come back to that later. But also the bigger question is about what kind of domestic changes he wants to bring to the country, and will that have any implication for India or not?
Thank you, Aditya. We come back to Bhagya, and so my second question to you is: how will the new government formulate its foreign policy?
Very, very interesting question. Something I think we're all looking at because they're a very new party in governance. They haven't been in this kind of a setup, as Rajni mentioned. They're kind of like an outsider. They were the third option for a long time. And here we have them in governance, taking actively. I mean, they're really, really involved. And if you look at the manifesto also, they don't really have a strong foreign policy component. So some of the questions I have is, what would they be doing? Would they continue their lines on the pro-China factor, or we also see, like Aditya mentioned, there's a lot of engagement with India. Dr. Jaishankar was just in Sri Lanka last Thursday. So it's interesting to see that these engagements they're having. And more so because as a newbie into all of this, especially in terms of foreign policy, leave aside domestic policy, we see them actively engaging. Even prior to the elections, Dissanayake was engaging with almost all the embassies. He was touring internationally, not necessarily to speak to governments, but you could see that he was engaging outside, and lots of governments were also engaging with Dissanayake. Even though they don't have, in principle, in their manifesto about what they would be doing, I think Dissanayake is mature enough to engage with countries across the border. And I think you can see this happening with the kind of meetings he's having. He's been engaging even with multilateral institutions. World Bank just released a note saying that they've committed to 200 million to Sri Lanka for economic recovery. So, and ADB was one of the first to meet the president. So I think it's interesting to see his engagements with all these countries, with the multilateral institutions. So I think he's probably going to have a fairer kind of stake in his interactions internationally. But I think in this conversation, we kept saying how a parliamentary election is important. So I think that is really important even in terms of executing foreign policy, because even if the president has some intention, has some understanding of what he wants to do, it would be really difficult to do it if he doesn't have a parliamentary majority, or if the parliament is not supporting him in the kind of engagements he does. So I think the upcoming general election will be something we would have to look at. I think we are all cautiously optimistic in the fact that he would, sanity would prevail, and that he would possibly do something that is best for Sri Lanka.
Dr. Rajni, what do we expect to see from the new government? Do we see a radical change or mainly rhetoric?
I think at this stage, perhaps what we can expect after the parliamentary elections, once he has a better sense of how much of a majority, first of all, to be able to secure a majority, and in doing so, being able to appeal to as wide a constituency as possible. So all the way from the liberal constituencies to the more conservative voting blocks, whether we kind of think about it on the economic sense, but also in terms of ethnic politics that has had a long history in Sri Lanka. So I would say that kind of a reading of Dissanayaka's actions right now should be very much be taken with the idea that general elections are coming. But I mean, just to kind of make sense of some of the actions of the NPP government so far from a political perspective, it would be that, as we all know, Dissanayaka has one of his major challenges is expectations management. Because the NPP rode such a strong anti-establishment kind of angry vote against the political establishment and the elite political class, the president's biggest challenge right now, I think, is to meet those expectations, and that too on a regular basis. As we all know, in politics, delivery of these expectations has to be regular. If otherwise, the voter base starts to get disenfranchised by the establishment. So how we see this play out, for example, is on the first grounds, and I think Talal would probably have a lot more knowledge on this, is that we see a lot of continuity with regard to the economic policies. Not only in the continuation of the IMF program, but also in certain appointment of key economic individuals. We see a lot of continuity with the kind of pro-IMF, pro-market kind of signaling that the NPP was giving, especially to the business community in the lead up to the elections. So that we have on the one hand. But then we also have we see certain signs of Dissanayaka's challenge in trying to also appease the original and strong left voter base and constituency within the JVP, but also within his support base. And these signaling we see in certain things, such as a recent, I think, statement that the Sri Lankan Airlines, which was scheduled to be privatized, would not be privatized. There was also today a news article, again, these are not confirmed, these are things that are in the process, a news article that said that restructuring and reforms with the Ceylon Electricity Board are also being rethought. So as a political kind of analyst, one of the things that occur to us is whether this kind of signaling is to also appeal to the more left-leaning sections of the NPP as well as the NPP's voter base. Very quickly, if I move on to the second action that we see the president doing, is his strong forte, which is the promise to bring about a change in the political culture, so thereby meeting the demands of the Aragalya for a system change. And the foremost campaign issue that he kind of championed on this ground was an anti-corruption mandate. And so we see at the moment the president kind of reaching out for the low-hanging fruits of anti-corruption, whether it is in terms of cutting down on state waste, like wastage of public expenditure. But we also see certain significant, like substantial moves that the president is making, such as in the recent sacking of Sali, who was involved in, I think, a key individual, a controversial individual that was involved in the Easter bombings. So we see the government reaching to kind of low-hanging fruits of anti-corruption, but also making some substantial moves. I think probably I will stop it here, kind of just basically driving home the idea that when a party comes into power with high expectations of very good governance, but also to some degree populist promises of meeting the democratic aspirations of the people, meeting those aspirations, especially in a time of economic constriction, is going to be a challenging one.
Talal Rafi, will there be any significant change with how Sri Lanka will deal with the IMF? Will the government fulfill these conditions or change them to their convenience? And then, of course, would the reforms be sustainable?
Yes, sure. Yeah. So the first one, would there be significant changes for the IMF? So before the elections, I mean, there were things coming out of the NPP campaign that, for example, the debt sustainability analysis, the DSA targets would be changed. So that meant that, if those are changed, some of the broader framework, then the whole IMF program would have to be renegotiated in a big way. So, but after coming to power, the positive sign is that President Dissanayake has said that he will continue with the IMF program. But there are two key things, as I mentioned before, he has said. The changes would be changes in tax brackets, like how they tax the rates coming down, and also more spending on social security. So in that view, I don't think there's going to be a very broad change. As I mentioned, he's also the central bank governor is continuing, and also the Treasury Secretary, one of the key figures, is also continuing. So those were key appointments put by the president, showing that he wants to continue with this program. Because at the moment, they realize that there is no alternative to the IMF program. Like, for example, if any drastic changes, and most of the negotiations are going to come in, especially on these two changes after the general election. So if by any chance things don't go well, and I don't think it'll happen, but in the worst case, the IMF program comes to a halt, then it's going to mean that World Bank ADB funding will also come to a halt. And most of the debt restructuring, those are connected there. So I think they are well aware of what could go wrong if the IMF is withdrawn. So as what's coming out of the government after 2 weeks is that only taxation and social security spending, those are the two things that they would like to renegotiate with the IMF. And as far as the reforms, I mean, to be quite frank, it's just 2 weeks, and we'll have to see after the general elections. But the president has got himself into quite a tough spot, because there are, we can do all these, the minor low-hanging fruits can be taken, but there are some very, very tough reforms that Sri Lanka has to go through. Like, for example, as Dr. Rajni said, he has come with a lot of expectations, like promised subsidies, tax cuts, and salary increases. So at the moment, we already have a fiscal deficit, and we are already struggling to keep to the IMF primary budget surplus of 2.3%. That's a key requirement by the IMF. So the problem comes when you have to do the tough reforms in order to achieve this. Like, for example, one of the key reforms that has to be done would be state-owned enterprises. So here again, a fact is that Sri Lanka, for a population of 22 million, so that's like a large city in India has more people than Sri Lanka. So for such a country, we have around 1.5 million state employees. So which takes, I mean, in 2022, when the crisis hit, it was over 80% of government revenue was going only to paying salaries and pensions to state sector employees. So a similar situation like in Argentina. So that is something that he has to deal with. Like an example is the Sri Lankan Airlines. It's recently been told a couple of days ago, I think, that it won't be going through. The privatization won't be going through. So here again, we have to note that the Treasury took over $500 million of Sri Lankan Airlines debt onto itself. So $500 million is a lot of money for a $80 billion economy. That's more than 1 year of social security budget for Sri Lanka. So that's how much loss this one airline has got. So, continuing, it's going to be quite tough because this was a profit-making airline in 2008, which in partnership with Emirates, but then it was nationalized fully and it's gone into losses. So what the experts say is that even experts in airlines, they find it very difficult to make profits. So a government, that's going to be one key challenge. So state-owned enterprises is a that's almost like the elephant in the room for Sri Lanka. The other thing, whether it's sustainable, is the tax reforms. Let's admit that this is very rare for a sitting president who came in 2022, who he has marketed himself as rescuing the country from fuel queues to stability, but then he only got 17% of the vote. 83% of the people did not vote for him. So this is quite shocking for a sitting president. So one of the key reasons why he was popular was because of some of the tax measures he took, especially among the middle and upper classes. So for President Dissanayake to continue with the IMF program and to continue even making Sri Lanka sustainable for the next few years, at least for the rest of his term, he needs to increase tax revenues. So Sri Lanka, I think, right now is at around 12%. So in 2022, we were 8% of GDP, which is one of the lowest in the world. So it was at 12%. The IMF program wants it to be at 15% by 2025, which is still low when compared to many countries in the world. So attaining that itself has sent the previous president packing home. So Mr. Dissanayake has to go achieve that target, and beyond 2025, though it's not a requirement, he has to go beyond that, in my view, to keep Sri Lanka sustainable. Forget about the reforms. Then the other things are trade reforms. Like, for example, Sri Lanka is one of the most protected economies in the world. So tariffs are high. So in order to get into global value chains, we need to have more free trade agreements, bring trade liberalization. So still not sure how it will go with a left-leaning party. Then land reforms. It's for Sri Lanka, 82% of Sri Lanka's land is owned by the government. Only 18% of land is owned by the 22 million people. So government holding on to 82% of the land makes it very difficult, because people, one thing is they can, most of them, the government gives it out on lease, but then they cannot use it as collateral. And if it's not their land, they don't take care of it or put long-term investments on it. So there are some very key structural reforms that are needed. So I think with a mandate, if they can do it, the new government can go on for the rest of the term and even win a second term. But at the same time, what Sri Lanka's history shows is that when you take on very tough reforms, you gradually become unpopular, like the previous president or even the government in 2015 to 2019. So he's in a bit of a spot. So if you, for example, don't do the reforms, things can be okay for a year or two, but then the economy could tank once again. So it's a bit of a very tough situation to be in. So we'll have to wait and see how things go. He needs all the support he can get.
Whole scenario unfolding. We are, of course, still in a very early stage of the president's work there, and the parliamentary elections, the key parliamentary elections are ahead of us. I'm sure that, when you are in power, then you learn a lot about how to actually deal with things. So, Aditya, can you tell us what are the future of India-Sri Lanka relations?
I think, starting from where we left previously, I think there is a lot of optimism between India and Sri Lanka at this point in time. For example, let's consider what happened in 2020 or 2021, when the Rajapaksas were in power, there were a lot of issues between India and Sri Lanka, right? There was a point in time where India, Japan, and Sri Lankan trilateral project was just unilaterally suspended, and that did leave a very negative mark to Japan as well as India. And ever since India and Sri Lanka tried to repair their relations, but it only came to its full-fledged form with the economic difficulties emerging in Sri Lanka. India's assistance of $4 billion did play a significant role. India, took up this whole challenge in a way of when the Aragalya happened. It took up this whole non-partisan, holistic kind of an approach, where it tried talking to people across the party lines, where it tried engaging with people across the party lines, and it also came in with this motto of bringing in more private sector investment. Look, the $4 billion was one part of it, but then this was also followed up with a lot of private sector investments, some of them which Anura has said he would be cancelling it, but then the others which are continuing to go on its full-fledged basis. In my opinion, I think there is a growing, understanding in Sri Lanka that India is no longer the India that it was in 80s or 70s with the LPG reforms that took place in 1991. India is now has its own economic leverage and growth, and there is this growing realization that if Sri Lanka has to economically recover and be more resilient to external shocks, there has to be more interdependency and connectivity with India. And one interesting thing that I realized when I spoke to a couple of analysts, including Bhagya, when I was in Sri Lanka a couple of weeks ago, is they continue to say that this was a crucial question I asked, right? India is also now significantly investing in mega infrastructure projects in ports, even in Kerala. Would that be a kind of competition for Sri Lankan ports or the amount of ports that are coming up in Sri Lanka? The immediate answer was no, right? They say with the way that India is growing, there is a lot of expectation in Sri Lanka that it could supplement its growth by bringing in, transshipment facilities, by bringing in more port facilities. They could rather supplement India's growth rather than seeing India in itself as a challenge to itself. So I think there is a significant optimism when it comes to economic relations and economic interactions. That said, there are political challenges which I think any neighbors will face, especially with what Rajni and Talal have been trying to say in terms of the expectations from the government, in terms of being this, trying to cater to its leftist needs, but also trying to cater to what has to happen in terms of broader economic growth and recovery. There has been some kind of push from Anura's side that, trying to portray themselves as someone who would not go with subsequent privatization, that who would not go with privatizing all of the disvesting the state-owned enterprises, which a lot of Indian firms have expressed interest in. I think that would be one of the concern for India. Second, I think obviously a lot of these projects that were spoken with President Ranil Wickremesinghe, including the land connectivity bridge project, right, that has been under negotiation since 2001. The problem with India-Sri Lanka bilateral initiatives is a lot of things get talked about and then governments change and none of them gets implemented at the end of the day. I think that is something that India will keep an eye out for in the coming 4 or 5 years, because at this point in time when India is itself investing in significant economic growth and infrastructure, and I think Sri Lanka is seeing optimism when integrating with India, that will always be something that is discussed. But then there is also this nationalist sentiments about opening up too much to India, right? There is this reservation that any politician should cater to, because there is a fear that if there is too much economic integration with India, then Indian labor might come into Sri Lanka and, might take away their jobs. I mean, this might not be the reality, but the perceptions and the nationalism and the history that is built this way and portrayed this way, I think that is a significant challenge. What I sense would be a significant challenge, in my personal opinion, is the fact that, again, that depends on how much President Dissanayake will be able to win and his party will be able to win in the parliament elections. But there have been significant promises in terms of, changing the constitution, right? There was this point in time when President Dissanayake said that there will be a whole restructuring in the constitution and he will also do away with the executive presidency system. The point then comes across what happens to the whole 13th Amendment, the question of 13th Amendment, right? India has been consistently pushing for consistent subsequent Sri Lankan governments to implement the 13th Amendment Act. This was also the case when President Ranil Wickremesinghe was here, but now all of a sudden you have a president who is saying that we will do away with all kind of, whatever the constitution is, and we'll try to bring in a new constitution. So that in itself, I think, is somewhat of a challenge, because India, I think, is still insistent on getting 13th Amendment implemented. But for any Sri Lankan president, I think, in my personal opinion, it would be a suicidal move. Having 13th Amendment implemented means also that they are upsetting a majority of voter base, and that would, consistently damage their image within the country. So Anura Dissanayake has a tough rope to walk on. He's promising constitutional changes, but he'll also have to cater to his Sinhala voter base, and he'll also have to cater to the nationalist voter base. And he'll also have to try to, basically guarantee India that whatever changes are happening will not impact the region's security, and will not have a spillover impact as such. Because India and Sri Lanka, I think there is this growing realization in Sri Lanka as well, post-war, that federalism is the best way to address. Rather than federalism, it's uniting and making a unified front within the country, and having this broader inclusive nationalism is something that is gonna, build Sri Lanka resilient, and is gonna bring in more economic growth. Now, that is an optimism, but to what extent Sri Lanka will be able to cater to it is a big challenge. And I think, yes, there are opportunities and challenges, and we'll have to wait and watch as things unfold.
Thank you. Bhagya, will the new government be able to enhance its leverage its agency as the Indian Ocean sees increasing competition?
So I'm guessing this question comes on the heels of all the activities President Wickremesinghe has been doing in the Indian Ocean region, taking a very active, prominent role of championing IOR issues. I think this government has only been there for 2 weeks. There's a lot of questions, I think, even amongst us Sri Lankans, about not just domestic politics, but also how his economic policies would pan out, how his foreign policies would pan out. Because I think the understanding is a lot of people, a lot of politicians say many things in their manifestos, but little do we see all of those things actually being implemented. Again, like I said, Dissanayake does not have a history, does not have experience in governance, let alone foreign policy. So championing IOR issues would be good for Sri Lanka. But whether Dissanayake would have the capacity, given all the issues Rajni and Talal has been talking about, I think domestic issues would take more of a prominence, a forefront in Disanayake's government compared to, say, foreign policy issues. It would be good if he focuses on the IOR, because that's a need. And also, Sri Lanka comes as an independent say a moderate country that can actually reach out to a broader IOR, not just islands, but a lot of the littoral states in the IOR. So I think it would be good if we see this kind of work happening. But it's too soon to say whether he would actually take this key role. Because there are so many other things that Sri Lanka needs to put together for the house to be in order. So I think foreign policy at this sense will possibly take somewhat of a back role. It will be on the back burners for a while, only until those majority issues like economic policies are sorted out. For then, I think there'll be a reach out to different countries to ensure that Sri Lanka can be, back in the game. But I don't think IOR will be one of those prominent issues that's going to come up in the media or in Disanayake's government going forward.
Thank you. What does the election mean for Tamil and Sinhala nationalism and politics? That's a very important, sort of two poles, as it were, Tamil and Sinhala nationalism. And so
Yes.
When we look at the JVP in particular, and I don't know how the current JVP looks at it.
Yes, I think maybe a good way to answer this would be I follow up on your last question to me, which was more or less, will there be a structural shift with the Dissanayake presidency? Because once we look at it, say, from a class perspective, I mean, I think that when we talk about nationalism, it's always good to root it in economic, so the material realities. When we look at it from a class perspective, the NPP coming into power was argued on the one hand to might be another 1956 moment for Sri Lanka, when certain rural classes in Sri Lanka were brought into more privileged positions. And so to an extent, this can be argued, but then on the other hand, we also saw that the NPP provided leadership for a lot of middle-class voters. So the verdict is still not very strong on that. So then when we go to the second question of has there been a structural shift with the NPP presidency, the kind of foremost ideology that comes to mind is Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, because this has been a dominant ideology within the Sri Lankan state. And will that be challenged under an NPP government? And again, on this, I think there are camps for and against. On the one hand, the JVP, the main party within the NPP, the JVP's kind of strong Sinhala Buddhist nationalism and very proactive stance it took, especially in the early 2000s, in pushing towards the restarting of the last phase of the Elam War. We cannot forget that. In addition to that, even in the lead up to the elections, we did hear the NPP candidate, Dissanayake, say that perpetrators of war crimes, that they would not be persecuted, basically signaling that the reconciliation mandate that the 2015 government had started and which had been halted under the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government, signaling that kind of transitional justice as conceptualized from a liberal worldview would not be continued. Kind of moving from there, what I want to argue is that kind of previously I had also mentioned that the Northern Tamil vote had been alienated during this election. And that is a very concerning sign, because usually during the presidential elections in Sri Lanka, this is usually arguably the only democratic moment when the Northern Tamil vote is able to significantly influence the elections. But in 2019, that was not possible because the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government won on a majority Sinhala vote. And in this election too, we see that the Northern Tamil vote does not significantly influence the electoral outcome. And so this is very concerning in terms of alienation of the Northern Tamil voter and what does that mean for the ethnic issue. The way forward for the president, it's kind of an open book for us right now, because I said on the one hand, we have certain indicators that show that he will continue with the Sinhala Buddhist mandate, but then also we see on the other hand, the president making at least some advances on the reconciliation front with regard to the Easter attacks. Now, the Easter attacks is something that's primarily affects the southern part of Sri Lanka. But in a speech yesterday on the terms of justice over the Easter attacks, the president kind of touched on two major components of transitional justice, which is accountability for perpetrators of the crime of the Easter attacks, because that case is still ongoing many years after it occurred, and also non-recurrence. So it appears that the president understands the concept of transitional justice, but whether he has the political will and the interest in applying that to result in a lasting solution on the Tamil issue, I think that's a very open question. I wouldn't be very pessimistic because, I mean, on the one hand, we do see that the NPP, we cannot read the NPP the same way that we read the Yahapalana government or the Rajapaksa government. So maybe the NPP is actually implementing a kind of politics that is unique to Sri Lanka. Not completely unique, but a kind of departure from the two main governments. And so is there a possibility that Dissanayake invites to his cabinet members of the Northern Tamil community? Because this has not, I think, except for one exception with Douglas Devananda, this has not been the case in Sri Lanka. Our cabinet has not had a Northern Tamil voter. Dissanayake can make a big paradigm shift by inviting, a Northern Tamil MP to join the cabinet. So whether in his calculations this actually serves him, and whether it actually is kind of indicative of his genuine leftist commitments to kind of foster a more inclusive nationalism, I think the verdict is still out on that.
Difficult issue. As a journalist, I began, one of my first things was to cover the Sri Lankan situation back in 1987, and, when the Indian forces went there. I was with the Hindu newspaper at that time. And so obviously what was happening in Sri Lanka was very, very important for the Hindu. The strange thing is that the Hindu chose a correspondent from the north to cover the Sri Lankan issue, because within Tamil Nadu itself there would have been biases, hidden biases. So my next question. Pardon?
Sorry, Chair, could I just add maybe just one point there, I think, which I was trying to say, because it is important, I think, to this issue of Tamil nationalism and Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, which is, I think, Aditya mentioned before, that the possibility that if the NPP gains a 2/3 majority, that it would change the constitution, and the implications this has, right, in terms of the 13th Amendment. But something that I wanted to flag here is that in the NPP's campaign rhetoric up to the elections, the way in which it framed devolution of power was not in terms of the 13th Amendment. So not necessarily in terms of, devolution of land and police power, but interestingly, it was more committed to this idea of devolution of power to the village, kind of more DS, even a smaller than a district level devolution of power. And so I think that this is something that maybe we can watch out for, because if a constitution change happens, would the NPP push for devolution on units that are different to the provincial council as envisaged by the Indian, Indian kind of advocated 13th Amendment? And if such a devolution happens at a smaller village level, what does this mean? On the one hand, it supports this leftist idea of empowering the local communities. But on the other hand, does it go against the idea of a collective Tamil identity? I think that's a question that we have to grapple with.
I'll go on to my question to Talal Rafi. How will Sri Lanka look upon India and China for economic growth and connectivity?
So thanks. So I've spoken about this before. As far as I think, not just in the economic sense, but even in the political sense, relations with India is going to be, in my view, should be priority number one, because for Sri Lanka, it's India and Sri Lanka share a language, similar cultures, and we are right next to each other. So as far as relations go, I think India will always should be number one priority above any other country. So that's a statement I think rings true, especially as far as I'm concerned when it comes to the political and economic side. So the reason I say this is because I also wrote a piece for ORF on this, what are the benefits of aligning with India. So as far as we are concerned, I think there's a lot of opportunities because especially when it comes to connecting with India. One is the poorest part of Sri Lanka is the north. And one of the most advanced or fastest growing region in India is the south, especially Tamil Nadu, the second most industrial state. And it's growing at a nominal GDP rate of, I think, double digits. So even Deloitte put out a study that the economy of Tamil Nadu by 2034 will be a $1 trillion economy. And if it's continuing at this stage, by the early or mid 2040s, the economy of Tamil Nadu would be even larger than the Russian economy. I mean, if the growth rates are the same. So that's where we have. So we have this people of the same ethnicity in the north, which is also the poorest part of Sri Lanka. So if there is more collaboration, I think it's a huge benefit for Sri Lanka, especially. So that's point number one. The second thing is, I think with India growing so fast, I mean, at some points even hitting 8% and projected to grow even faster in the coming years. I think Sri Lanka is, I've said this before at other panels as well, like how Singapore positions itself as the gateway to the ASEAN region, or Dubai as the gateway to the Gulf states. Sri Lanka can very well position itself as the gateway to India. So that is another key thing that Sri Lanka can hold on to. So as far as economic relations go, there are other many great opportunities. Like, for example, renewable energy. The World Bank shows that the offshore wind energy potential of Sri Lanka itself exceeds Sri Lanka's demands. So I was speaking to Dr. Montek Aluwalia, who was in Colombo recently, and he was like, he's working with the Tamil Nadu government. So he said there's a report showing that, Sri Lanka's offshore wind power potential could even be like twice or thrice its needs. So there is potential if there is a grid to export energy towards the fast growing southern parts of India, and even exporting it if we can work on green hydrogen. So as far as relations go, to be very practical, I think it makes more sense to be more aligned with India on the economic front. But at the same time, we also need to consider relations with China. So China, we've had a very long history, starting from the 50s. They have been investing with us for quite some time. And as far as, bilateral debt goes, China is our largest creditor. So relations have to be adjusted. But at the same time, as all governments say, especially when it comes to security and on the political side, we always have to understand the concerns of India. So that's quite important because the saying goes that, Sri Lanka has many best friends, but India is a brother. So, so the thing is that friends may help, may not help, but brothers always help. As 2022, the $4 billion showed that it was India that came forward. That's what the world knows, but also on many other fronts, like, for example, pushing the IMF to give a faster package sooner was by Indian Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, as former President Ranil Wickremesinghe himself thanked. And the first country to give debt assurance was India. So there are a number of things in which India has helped come forward before anybody else. So as Sri Lankans, we are always thankful and appreciative of that. But at the same time, to be on a lighter note, if anything goes wrong with friends, can always, they not talk or something. But with a brother, as anybody who knows who has a elder brother when we were small, things can, things can get a bit ugly. So what I'm saying is India will always be like a brother to us. So on the economic front, it's Sri Lanka has a lot to gain from relations with India.
I think often it's not understood just how close India and Sri Lanka are. Most Indian coastal traffic from the east to the west goes around Sri Lanka, not through the Park Straits. And it's 40, 60 kilometers across. Sri Lanka is far from everywhere else but India, And so there is this thing, and of course, our ties go back, have almost into mythology. The roots go into mythology, and the advantages, I think, what Talal has just pointed out, meaning with a growing economy, with a buoyant economy, the kind of win-win scenarios that we can see are very obvious. The point is to put them, cut through politics and get into doing things. That's what I think the people in Sri Lanka are looking for in their when they voted. They wanted some kind of break from the past and a shift to the future. So, Aditya, my question to you is, will India be able to continue its good relations and leverage on its connectivity, meaning this linked to this?
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, as I spoke previously, I think there are significant advantages that India has. Look, the $4 billion that India offered, which Talal has rightly pointed out, has played a significant role in fostering this goodwill across, with people across party lines. In fact, it was very surprising for anyone who looks at Sri Lanka's politics that, foreign policy was very least discussed in the recent elections, right? It was mostly economics, good governance. So that in itself indicates, that India, which was often being dragged into domestic politics of it, is less discussed today than it was in the past. That said, again, as neighbors, you will have your own irritants and you will have your own benefits, and that will be politicized. But I think two things, right? One, we look at it from a political side, and then we look at it from a civilian side. I think politically, uh, obviously, India has reached out across party lines and helping with the $4 billion assistance and coming up with a lot of private sector investments, and subsequent assistance in itself is doing a lot of good, and that gives more and more leverages for the Indian government for any point of time to also compel Sri Lanka to work with India, and also compel Sri Lanka to be sensitive to its concerns on security issues and other domestic political issues. That is there, but also what I sense in terms of certain sections in the civil society is there is already a growing sense of disenchantment towards Indian assistance. Now, I say this because there is optimism that India is, we need to integrate with India, but there is also a certain section of people who continue to criticize India, um, regardless of what it does, right? Because as a neighbor and as the history that India carries with Sri Lanka, I think that has always been there. So interestingly, quite a few people still draw parallels with the 1987 Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, where Indian troops were deployed in Sri Lanka, to what happened in 2022. So some people still in Sri Lanka believe that in 2022 India's assistance of $4 billion is some kind of an arm twisting mechanism, where they saw Sri Lanka was in a desperate situation, so India came into the rescue and tried investing and offering more and more economic projects and investments. So that kind of narrative still exists only in certain sections of society, but luckily or fortunately or by design, that has not been something that has been featured in the political spectrum or the political debate. um, so I think, broadly speaking, India will have its leverages. India will, I think, as Talal pointed out, with that economic growth and connectivity, India and Sri Lanka's relation will continue to boost. But that also said that there is a issue of perception management, which I think is a persistent problem throughout the neighborhood, and with especially with given the complex history that India and Sri Lanka has, I think India's projects will be politicized in a larger scale, either by people or by politicians. At least for now, we don't see the politicians doing it, so I think it's still on a on a good scale. But we have seen people protesting next to the Indian High Commission when they when protesting against the Adani projects in Sri Lanka. So I think that would be a difficult dichotomy for people to draw between what is a state investment and what is a private investment. So I think at some point of the time, the perspectives that exist in the civil society will trickle down to the government, trying to make it more politicized, and will motivate the political parties to politicize it. So how we manage it is a bigger question, but I think overall, the assistance we have given and the subsequent investments that have flown through it is offering a good leverage for India now, and I think that should be the case even in the future as well.
Thanks. I have asked my specific questions to each of you. I now want to just raise some general question, to the whole panel. One is, the question of, we have discussed India, we have discussed China, we have not looked at the United States. It's another important player. So when we look at that, when we think of the US policy, US and now EU policy, Indo-Pacific, the concept of Indo-Pacific plays a big role there. How does Sri Lanka plan to navigate the geopolitical churning in the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific region in the future? So I'll do a round robin, and I'll start with Bhagya.
I think if you're looking at it from the US perspective, I think US would be really interested in working with Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka has been sort of moving away from the US sphere of influence, so to say. So with this new government, it would be a top priority for the United States to kind of rope Sri Lanka back in and be on good terms, so that it would have less connectivity, less engagement with China. a country that Sri Lanka over the past couple of years has been, sort of tilting towards. This would also somewhat play into these connections Aditya, Talal have been talking about in terms of engagements or re-engagements with India, something again the Indian government would want to do. And of course, if you see the kind of connectivity, the kind of connections Ambassador Chang has brought in, this $500 million investment into the Indian and Japan port investment. And also the World Bank, IMF investments that are the assistance, economic assistance that's coming. So engagement for Sri Lanka with the United States is very, very important, I think. And I also think that the United States sees this from their perspective. So it's not just that Sri Lanka considers the US important, but also for the US to re-engage with Sri Lanka is important. And this also goes into your question, Chair, about the earlier Indian Ocean engagements. If Sri Lanka is a big player in or big partner with the United States, it would help the United States in its re-engagements in the Indian Ocean region. So I think for many reasons, it would be the same. EU, I think, would also want to have some engagements, but I think it would be on a lesser stage, because if you look at the past history, a lot of the EU countries, be it France, Germany, they have been coming in. You've seen foreign ministers coming in and talking about their realignment with the Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think these countries would continue to engage, but I guess the more important question would be, how would Sri Lanka take those engagements? What would President Dissanayake and subsequently his cabinet, how they would take these engagements forward?
Thank you. Rajni, would you give us your views?
Sure. I think just adding on to what Bhagya said, it's a very interesting question, because when we think of how European countries and the US, one of the ways, besides development projects, how do they make their presence felt within Sri Lanka? The most kind of issue that Sri Lanka has to reckon with is, of course, this issue of post-war reconciliation and transitional justice. And I think that which has been a challenge for all the past governments can only continue to be a challenge for the NPP government, especially, like I said before, because of the kind of signaling they have made on the reconciliation front, that they would probably not be as proactive as the Wickremesinghe government and the 2015 government was on the reconciliation front. And so then this again brings us to this issue of GSP plus, the kind of favorable trade conditions within the European Union. That was again an issue with Sri Lanka when progress on reconciliation front was not made. So this, I would say, is the first kind of challenge for the NPP government. And along with that, just a small word on civil society. We see that usually the US and European countries, one of their ways of exerting influence in Sri Lanka is through the civil society. And it's very interesting to observe the NPP's or the JVP's attitude towards civil society so far. There have already been measures from the time of the Rajapaksa government to regulate NGOs and kind of this kind of fear-mongering against NGOs and civil society. And so I think we can perhaps expect a certain element of that. Very quickly, also to say that we saw, including under the Wickremesinghe government, this term of the global south emerging in the president's discourse. And with the leftist governments such as Disanayake's, I think it would be quite interesting to watch and see whether he would continue to play on this idea of the global south, kind of a stance which Sri Lanka had taken, at its post-colonial moment, but it sort of died afterwards. In the context of the Israel war against genocide in Palestine, would the NPP take a very strong leftist stance on this, as many of its constituencies would push for it? Finally, I'll just say that we've been focusing a lot on the NPP, and then also the other main party, which is the SJB. But one of the things that we have noticed in the lead up to the elections is because there has been a liberal consensus, a sort of consensus in terms of, how power would be shared and continuity of the IMF program. We have seen the emergence of peripheral smaller parties, such as the Sarvajana Balaya, which are championing more stronger anti-Indian, anti-US, very economic nationalist, Sinhala Buddhist nationalist, chauvinist stances. And at the moment, this camp is very small. But I mean, there's nothing to say that this ideological camp would not gain power going forward.
Thank you. Talal?
Thank you. So, as far as navigating the geopolitics, so I was recently speaking to a professor from Oxford on international relations, and he was asking me like, Sri Lanka has done remarkably well for a small country to have good relationship with almost all the major powers. So here, Sri Lanka has a history, from 77 when we had a right-wing on the economic front government by President J.R. Jayawardena, we were more towards the US, better relationship with them. So since then, there has been a few hiccups here and there, especially with the government of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, where, projects by India and then even the light rail thing by Japan was cancelled. So the relationships got a little bit on the bad side. But then the previous president, I think, managed to do it well. So as far as how Sri Lanka would go, I think Sri Lankans still very few realize the importance of the US, the role it plays. Like, for example, if you look at the IMF or the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, it's largely funded by the United States, and it has considerable influence within them. And the other thing is most of the investments, because nowadays investments come in through large asset management firms, private equity, most of them come from the West. And at the same time, the bondholders, the bond terms, the bilateral debt restructuring laws, most are New York laws or London laws. So the West has considerable influence. And even when it comes to economic clout in the world, the US and its allies can together come up to over $50 trillion, the economic might. So which China cannot really challenge at the moment. So so it's still, though it's a world that is shifting towards multipolarity, still you could say to a large extent, it's a world dominated by the US. So the importance of that needs to be considered. And I think Sri Lanka as a nation is doing quite well. I mean, we've managed relationships with all the countries quite well. I mean, especially in the last 2 years. And going forward, we'll have to see how the new government goes through.
I think for the European Union, what we have seen, as Bhagya rightly pointed out, I think there is a growing tendency to increase its presence in Sri Lanka. But I think the bigger question is also to what extent is the EU willing to invest, given that there is a, there is a continuing conflict in Europe for the last 2 years. And I think that in itself restricts its material capacities and capabilities to invest in Sri Lanka. But I do think they will continue to increase their presence, mostly to humanitarian assistance, small community development projects. But as far as the US is concerned, I think the the US-China competition is intensifying, and everyone knows Sri Lanka is a country which is positioned around crucial sea lines of communications. And even for the US to move from, the Red Sea to the Southeast Asia, part of Southeast Asia, they will have to travel to the waters of the crucial sea lines of communications of the Indian Ocean region. So I think that is where the importance of Sri Lanka sets in. Fortunately, I think the last 4 years, what we have seen in terms of US Sri Lanka policies, that there has been more cooperation and collaboration with India. With the Biden's Indo-Pacific approach, I think there was a consensus that at least there is a difference in how we see things in Bangladesh and other countries. But in Sri Lanka, at least there was a consensus that India will take a lead. India will have a primary say. And that's when the economic crisis happened, India was the first country to help. And once India helped, US got in to assist with the IMF negotiations and go ahead with other kind of assistance with the World Bank. And also what we have seen in terms of collaboration, as Bhagya rightly pointed out, again, the $500 million in the Colombo port city, which the Adanis are investing in, right? US has promised $500 million in terms of development finance cooperation. So overall, what we are seeing, at least in Sri Lanka, is that there is more cooperation, and the US is willing to work more with India. We don't know if what happens following the elections, if there has been a change, but if logic prevails and if sanity prevails, then I think US will continue to work with India, at least in Sri Lanka. Another probably important thing that we will have to see is, what first is, how is Sri Lanka in itself seeing this whole US India cooperation, and also with China, because again, if any Sri Lankan government gets closer to US, I think then it'll have repercussions coming from China as well. So for any Sri Lankan government, I think there is a need to balance. And when Anura Dissanayake was in India, he was also at ORF. There he made an interesting point that JVP's anti-India stance was not just and alone, or a standoff, a single-off stance, but it was also something that was related to nationalism per se. And given that time in the 1980s, when US was also having discussions of having a base in Trincomalee, there was consistent anti-US rhetoric that was at play. So right now, given the current world order, I think there is a realization in JVP that for JVP in itself to look at broader Sri Lanka-US relations, it'll have to be through India. So basically, good Sri Lanka-India relations might also possibly lead to good Sri Lanka-US relations, and that is their thinking on their basis. And I think that will continue to persist in the coming years as well, as long as JVP is in power. But interesting point to see also in the US is that there is a growing realization that realpolitik is at play. And despite so much of rhetoric about human rights and other democratic values and other kind of rhetoric that US has continued, the everyday interactions have gone and investments have continued to flow, and there is growing US's elevation of bilateral cooperation with Sri Lanka, right? And this is despite their stance on human rights, and that shows that the US has more interest in staying invested in the region. Now, does it want to do it by itself, or does it want to do in collaboration or cooperation with India, is a bigger question that we'll have to see.
Yeah.
So I think I would like to draw the attention to, I think, a report Aditya was editing for the ORF on this very issue, the complexities in the the South Asian continent. Plus, we have to realize, Chair, that US is also going in for elections, presidential elections in just a couple of days. So I think it will be interesting to see, I think, how their politics would also play out, because I think there's an interesting incline towards nationalism in the US itself, depending on who will come into power. So if they would be interested in working in the broader region, or whether they would be looking inwards, is also something I think we would have to consider. Secondly, there's an article I wrote, just a plug-in, on bilateral relations between US and Sri Lanka, and I talk a lot about the power dynamics in South Asia, in the in the Indian Ocean region, and also US's interests in the region. So I think that's also something those of you who want to could also read.
Thank you. Now throw open this to the floor, and I'll take questions. So please raise your hand and identify yourself before you. Yes.
My question is to Madam Bhagya. You have been tracking Pakistan-Sri Lanka relations for a long time. What is your take of how, in fact, this relation is going to pan out in future, in next 2 to 3 years? Because in the past, there was a deal with Sri Lanka by Pakistan that they will supply JF-17 aircrafts. I think six aircraft they were supposed to supply. What's the status on that? How it is going to taken forward? Thank you.
Well, I'll take another question. Then we'll ask.
Yeah, Madam Bhagya, sorry. The way we had this JV party in late 60s, it was a very hostile party, and till 80, and this AKD was also against India. And what about this lady Prime Minister? Do you think she will pacify this relationship between India and Sri Lanka to some extent?
Well, what I'll do is that I'll have Bhagya answer this, and then I have a question for the two of you, and I will pose that after that. Please.
Okay. So Pakistan, I think JF-17 was something that they were trying to do along with the Chinese, but of course Indian interventions were also seen, and that didn't necessarily go through. I think Sri Lanka is continuing to engage with Pakistan. It would have to because of the kind of ethnic constituencies within Sri Lanka. I think the latest I recall was that there was the FTA trying to go forward, and of course there is the sentiment of increasing bilateral trade between the two countries, looking at the terms of preferential trade. So those are the recent conversations. I don't recall reading anything new on other fronts, but Pakistan has always been an interesting and interested party that Sri Lanka works with. That's without saying that there is, of course, more interest, I think, working for Sri Lanka to work with India. Yeah, and of course, this question on Indo-Lankan relations and the Prime Minister, I don't really understand your question.
AKD, the hostile relationship with India, whether she will influence him or not.
It's hard to say, right? I don't know if it just being a woman would make a difference, or like the Prime Minister would have a say in anything, but it also depends on how the JVP functions, whether they would make decisions. And I think Rajni might be able to say more about the internal dynamics of the JVP, but I think it will depend more on how the JVP functions, whether they will have a majority say in what the NPP does, again, depending on if and when the parliamentary elections are held, and if the JVP or the MPP has a majority in parliament, would then that mean anything? But I don't think necessarily this Prime Minister would have a lot. I mean, she does have a lot of progressive views. The MPP is doing a lot of new things. They are more inclusive. So I don't think like Indo-Lanka relations are necessarily bad at this time. So improvement would also factor in improvements with other parties, with other countries, right? So I mean, Sri Lanka wouldn't necessarily continue improving only India's bilateral relations with India. It would have to be alongside other developments, or it will be a one-off. So I think I don't think this female PM itself is going to make a change, but it would have to be looked at in a broader context.
Thank you. What I'll do is that for two of our Sri Lankan guests who are speaking to us virtually, I'd just like to ask you just to make short closing statement, and you can pick on any theme that you wish to do. So first I'll ask Dr. Rajni.
Sure. I mean, I don't have a very broad statement to make. Maybe I'll just follow up on what Bhagya was talking about, because it's something that we have been kind of thinking about especially yesterday and today, which is this idea of inter-party democracy. For example, let's think about if the Prime Minister, as a woman with more liberal kind of leanings, would she be able to have a significant say that is different to the President's? It really goes back to this idea of the democracy within the party. And in Sri Lanka, all political parties are largely undemocratic. One of the reasons I'm saying this is because today I saw in the newspapers that for the general elections, the MPP has said that the party prefers the voters to vote for the party rather than for the preferences. So within our parliamentary system, we have a system where you mark a cross for the party, but you also indicate the candidates. But the NPP, it's quite unprecedented in that it is not unprecedented in the JP's history, but unprecedented in mainstream political culture. It has indicated to mark for the party rather than for the candidates. And the slightly counter to democratic implications of this is that it is not the people who determine who the MPs are, but it is the party which determines it. And this kind of harks back to this concerns with all political parties, like I said, but especially with the JVP. How much of democracy is there within the party? Is it a very centralized kind of control decision-making that happens? And then what implications do we have when we look at the broader democratic implications for the country. So I think probably with that statement, yeah, I would like to end it.
Sorry?
You have the last word, I said.
Sure.
We'll close
Thank
after
you. Right. So my final remarks, I would say Sri Lanka is in a fork in the road, I would say, where we can, it's a tough, challenging environment. Like I mentioned before, very tough structural reforms are needed. State-owned enterprise reforms, even the tax reforms, like the president brought it from 8% to 12%, became unpopular, and for the first time, a sitting president got only 17% of the vote. So it's going to be a very challenging road ahead for Sri Lanka. And at the same time, because we have around over half of our GDP worth of debt in foreign currency, it's also very, very important to manage relationship with countries, the rest of the world, especially with the US, India, and China. And at this time, Sri Lanka, I would say, closing, it needs to prioritize the relations. So in 2022, the country that came to our aid was India with $4 billion. And as our former foreign minister was saying, when he was at the IMF, speaking to the IMF's managing director, the IMF chief had told him that when India's finance minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, came, she spent over 75% of the time speaking on behalf of Sri Lanka and only 25% on India. So that was the sort of priority India gave. So Sri Lanka going forward should know that, in a situation, how important relations with certain countries such as India would be. And as the new president and the past governments have said, Sri Lanka will have good relations with everyone, but we will always take concerns of India seriously when moving forward. Thank you.
Come to the end of this discussion, and I'm sure that you will all agree that we have had a very wide-ranging discussions, despite the fact that the government is very, very young and has to look at a parliamentary election in the future. So while, as I close out here, I think we have tea next door. But before that, I'd like you to give a hand to our panelists. So thank you once again, especially our Sri Lankan guests. Good evening.